Welcome to my presentation. Today I want to introduce you to the concept of public mobility planning. And with that I want to discuss some potential for the implementation of public mobility planning in Europe, or some question if it's just an illusion and some mad concept that doesn't have any uses for practices. But first, let's start with some central terms I want to discuss first, because I think it's really important that when we talk about theories or concepts, that we have a common understanding what the meaning is behind some of these phrases. And the first phrase I want to discuss is the phrase of public mobility. Public mobility is a concept we developed at our department at the Technical University in Berlin, and it can be seen as a normative framework for the public transport sector. So it gives a guidance, a central goal for the public transport sector to work towards, and it also can be used as a reference point for theories and practices alike. So in this book, which also has the title Prerequisites for Human-Oriented Transport Planning, I think that's a really central part of public mobility. And we have a lot of different articles from practitioners to scientists, and all talk about the concept of a normative framework that is called public mobility and how it can be used in the practice of public transport planning. In my opinion, it's quite intuitive, the concept, but still unexplored, especially in Germany. So there's a lot of potential to use some theories like public mobility to also enrich the transportation planning and practices. So in the end, public mobility is a guidance that shows a way how we can transform the public transport to a public mobility. And as I was saying, it's really important that the words or the phrases are quite clear to everyone. So let's look at some of these differences that we can see between public transport and public mobility. So what's the difference except for just the change of phrases? So the first one is that in classical public transport planning, we have majorly traffic-oriented variables. We look at the means of transport and try to optimize them, interchange them. And public mobility is a whole new perspective. Public mobility looks at the human first, so it's quite human-oriented, and therefore looks at availabilities, not at the means of transport, but availabilities for mobility as a whole. So which options do the people have, which different modes are available to them to satisfy their needs. So it can also include not transport-oriented measures, for example, like the supply of central goods for daily lives, etc. That's also part of public mobility that wasn't part of public transport. Also, public transport classically focuses on the technical solutions with schedules and timetables. And of course, they are important, and especially with new technologies, there are a lot of new potentials there, but it's not enough. We also have to look at the social level with different solutions, and public mobility goes about that with informations and diversification. So the central point is here to enrich the mobility of the citizens with information on the one hand, which is really important, but also diversification, so they are not in need of just this one transport mode, but they have many different options to reach their desired destinations. And that's a really different way of looking at the service of mobility, and that's the final part here. Public transport gives transport as a service, or defines transport as a service, and public mobility defines mobility as a service. So that's quite more than just the transport or the traffic from A to B. It's more, and for public transport we only needed one actor, the public transport corporations that organize and work out all the different plans and different schedules. But with public mobility we need more actors, and not only transport or traffic actors. So it's a multi-actor system, and that's the main difference between public transport and public mobility. And as we already saw, so public mobility is a central connection to the concept of mobility as a service. And I think it's also really important. That's still quite new of a concept. Mobility as a service is a current development in transport research and science, that we start to integrate all these different means of transport into a whole concept of mobility as a service. We have many different accelerating factors that influence this development. We have the digitalization, the availability of data and information. We have the liberalization of the transport sector, so many new actors working there and providing mobility. We have the platformization, which also can be a challenge or a danger if it develops into monopolies. Or we also have the transport innovation, the new technological services, mobility systems that also provide mobility. And all of these factors transform the public transport sector as a whole, and mobility as a service is a concept to integrate all these solutions. But, and that's a really important part in combination with public mobility acts here as a normative framework to include all these different mobility as a service or mobility services into a wholesome or a holistic service that is for the common good. Yeah, that's the important part here, the combination between public mobility and mobility as a service, that it's stately governed, that it's for the common good. The second phrase I want to talk about is mobility planning. So it's a different combination of words, and it's also really important for me that we discuss the meaning behind this phrase first, because it's a concept that's quite close to my heart. I developed this over the last couple of years, and it's really important also here to understand the difference, especially in context of the classical transportation planning. So what is mobility planning? It's a new approach to planning. It's a further development of the integrated transportation planning concept, and right now I'm working on a manuscript that's gets published this year. That is a book for practitioners to understand or get the basic knowledge of what's behind mobility planning, what's the difference. So part of that is an integration of mobility management and mobility as a service into a holistic planning approach. So the whole processes and instruments behind the classical planning is in need of a change when we want to look at mobility and not only and traffic. So that's a field I'm working on right now, and in the end it's a strategic empowerment of human mobilities as a central reference point for planning. So that's a major shift in focus. We will look at this in a second, but in the end it's a guide on transforming the transport planning into a mobility planning, which in my opinion is the future of the transportation planning sector, and therefore there's a huge need in research in theory but also in practice implementation of this concept of mobility planning. So the same as with public mobility and public transport, we can look at some of the deeper concepts behind these phrases of transport planning and mobility planning. First, transport planning is still mainly focused on the traffic itself. It doesn't look why the traffic happens, but mostly looks at the traffic that happened already and try to guide it or shape it. And therefore it assesses the traffic in capacity. So we look at infrastructures, how much they can carry per hour, and we look at different speeds of traffic flows, and in opposite mobility planning focused on the people. So therefore it assesses not in capacities but in accessibility. So which services can people reach? Maybe they need traffic for that, maybe they don't. So it can also include measures that are more spatial or urban development in nature, where we relocate services or distribute different kind of services in the space. And that's a really important part of mobility planning, that that's not included in classical transportation planning. Therefore, transport planning based on infrastructure mainly looks at infrastructure, how they can be improved, how the services can be improved. Mobility planning looks also into spatial and social system, because that's where the need is derived from. That's where the humans decide to move from A to B or to choose different modes of transport. That's where the important stuff is happening. So mobility planning tries to include it also. And we can see it, for example, in the Federal Ministry in Transportation in Germany. Transport planning is still really or mostly based on sectoral planning cultures, where we have different fields in the administrations, the railway field, the street guys, the water guys, the air planners, etc. So it's based on the modes of transport, and of course that's a totally different planning culture that's working there. In opposite to an integrated planning culture that looks at people and spaces first and then looks open-minded on different modes of transport, different constellation of services, of spatial constellation. That's a whole different approach to planning the mobility. And lastly, transport planning classically focused on the operational level, so providing services, providing infrastructure, whereas mobility planning is more strategic, so it's integrated with environmental, with sustainability goals, and has a strategic priority over the transport as a planning sector. And lastly, we have, especially in Germany, the planning of transportation mainly still an expertocratic process, who decides how wide streets should be, how long people have to wait on traffic lights, or how the street space should be allocated. And mobility planning accept that this is not an expertocratic or a natural scientific process, but it's a political process. So many of these key factors in transportation planning are not based on technological findings, but it's based on people's needs. So it's important to include them into the planning process, and mobility planning does that. So mobility planning sees the whole planning process as a political process, and uses different methods and instruments to use this kind of knowledge. And this is not a concept I developed. Mobility planning is an European-wide concept that's also on the EU level operationalized with the sustainable mobility plans, for example. So it's a concept that's quite well known, but it's quite hard to implement into practices. So what are 3 central fields of mobility planning? I think that's really important, because it also shows the difference to the classical transportation planning. Firstly, mobility analysis. So to analyze the human mobilities, to get a grasp of the status quo of the current spatial, societal and individual conditions for mobility. And only after we have a knowledge about this mobility, how it is right now, we can derive different measures. But before we can do that, and that's also quite new as a working field, we need also be involved in goal development. That's an important part of planning, especially if we recognize that planning is also a political process. We need to support decision makers and societies to define goals for the mobility, where mobility should develop to. And for example, also in Germany, we don't have that right now on the federal level. There are no goals what the mobility system or the transport system as a whole should look like. So it's only on the operational level, just keep the traffic flowing, but there's no strategic goal where to develop to. So, and only after we have the analysis and the goals, we can then in the third step design interventions, how we shape the status quo to better reach our goals. So that's the third part, the classical part, where we have different strategies or measures that transform the current mobility system regarding the mobility goals. So and these 3 major major field of works are quite characteristic for my concept of mobility planning. So in the end, we can combine now the concept of public mobility with the concept of mobility planning, and we derive at a public mobility planning that describes a goal-oriented designing of mobility within the framework of public services. That's really important part here. And with that, we need appropriate processes and instruments for these three major fields. The first one is to define goals together with society and decision makers. The second one is to provide planning with sufficient knowledge about mobility. And the third one is to change mobility in a goal-oriented manner. And only then can we achieve the objective to provide a mobility system and public responsibility that is independent from social demographic factors and inclusive for all. So, and that's something the private sector is not capable of. Of course, is not the major objective of the private sector. So that's really important part here about public mobility planning, that we use all this innovation and knowledge and create an integrated mobility system that serves the people, that is inclusive for the people and enriches the mobility of the people without a need of huge traffic flows and many negative effects of the classical transport planner. So after we discussed the theoretical concepts, it's now time to discuss if this is a future concept or just maybe a theory that's not really capable of being implemented to practice and just an illusion of science. So to answer these questions, we first have to look at some of these major challenges which I also encountered in my research in different parts. So I want to start with the complexity. Of course, mobility is quite more complex than traffic itself. I can just count traffic, I can just measure speeds or different traffic flows. Mobility, I can't just go on the streets and just count mobility. It's not possible. And if we look here on the left, we see the transport land use cycle, which is quite famous from Wegener, which shows some of the complexity and especially interdependency and multi-causality of the whole system. So there's a lot of different moving parts here that influence each other. And on the other hand, you can see some of my research I did in my PhD, where I developed a mobility index, and here I was researching which different factors influence our personal mobility, our subjective space of opportunity. And as you can see, they're quite different. There's accessibility, settlement structure, but also social perception, social networks, residential perception. So there are even different fields of research. So mobility is definitely a quite complex phenomena, and therefore way harder to understand and to design than traffic. And with that comes a knowledge gap. So the transdisciplinarity here is still a problem, especially since mobility research in the last couple of years found out a lot of really interesting and important stuff about mobility and transport. But if we look at practices, and that's not only in Germany, that's in the whole European Union the case, then we see that really only a small part of this knowledge gets implemented into practices. For example, in Germany, we have federal standards and regulation which doesn't recognize some simple concept for mobility research. We have the transport infrastructure plans, which not even include the basic finding 20 years ago that an increase in capacity of infrastructure induces demand. That's a common knowledge in mobility sciences, but still in transportation planning, it's not getting used to, it's not included into the strategic consideration, and of course that's a problem. And we also see this knowledge gap in public transport plans and transport development plans and urban development plans. So there's a lot of work to do to not find out new stuff, but get the knowledge into practice. I think that's a challenge right now. to bridge this gap and bring the knowledge to the practitioners. And third one, we have the interdisciplinarity itself, especially because mobility plan is in between engineering researchers and social research. So that's is not a problem itself. It's also potential, but as I was seeing in my researches, that they often use different kind of data sets, they use totally different methods, they have different scientific practices, and they even speak sometimes different scientific languages. So even when they speak together, or from an engineer to a social researcher, sometimes you get the feeling that they don't really understand each other. And of course it's a problem if we want to work interdisciplinarity. So they also need to connect or on same platforms, but in practice we mostly see that they use different platforms, different journals, different conferences to share their knowledge. And there's also huge challenge here to bring together this major parts of transportation and mobility research, and only then it's possible to really work on the concept of mobility planning, which is quite central. But to finalize, here are again the major three challenges. We have the complexity, we have the transdisciplinarity, and we have the interdisciplinarity, which are a huge challenge to overcome to reach the implementation of public mobility planning. But with these challenges, I don't want to end here, are also some potentials that we can use, or we starting to use already, to bridge these gaps and try to find new ways of coming closer to the implementation of public mobility plans. The first one is the closing of the knowledge gap. Here is the goal to empower the practitioners to understand and design mobility. So here we need, on the one hand, new knowledge and tools for the mobility planners itself. So for example, in my PhD, I developed this mobility index, which shows here in three main dimensions. So the structural dimension, the individual dimension, and the subjective dimension, here for example in the district in Berlin, and tries to make it better and easier to understand what mobility is. And so in the end we have here a mobility index who shows the planners where there are problems with the mobility. And as you have to remember, this is mobility, that's not traffic. Here's no traffic flows included in this charts. It's just accessibility, individual preconditions, and subjective feelings and the subjective spaces of people that is included in this indices. So now the planners have a base of knowledge to design different measures and also evaluate the impact of different mobility planning measures. So that's just one instrument that is needed to empower the practitioners to really understand mobility and can start to design mobility. We of course also need to enrich all the simulation and models we use so much in transportation planning with this mobility knowledge. This is possible, and some cities already doing it, that they are reworking their transportation models to include some of these basic concepts of mobility research, but there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of need of mobility scientists to help out here to guide this process. Second potential are the transformation of the public transport sector as a whole. So here's the central goal to achieve a public landscape that it's both efficient, of course that's always a problem here, but also inclusive at planning, that looks at the citizen, looks at the need of the people. And for that we can build new networks for mobility stakeholders. For example, here in Lower Saxony with Mobilicon, we have a database where we can connect these different, maybe from totally different fields of mobility actors. on a central network. We can support public institutions with change management. Many states in Germany already establishing platforms for that. In Lower Saxony is Mobilotsin, where the state supports the local planners to enrich their knowledge and change their way how they plan, how they go about this problem solutions. And lastly, we also need to redefine the planning structures, especially in public administration and in the public transportation corporations, because of course there's this huge transformation. We have a totally different approach to planning now. We have totally different mode of transport than we had 20 years ago. So of course also the structures have to support that, and we are need on a totally redevelopment of many of these structures. And I myself working together with some of these local planners and communities to help them to redefine how they want to organize the mobility planning as a new field of public administration. For example, in Munich, they already were building like mobility sectors there in the administration, but there are many different cities who also try to work it out. And lastly, there is the potential to integrate these different fields of expertise, these interdisciplinary characteristics, and see it as an opportunity to create a common understanding between transport engineers and mobility researchers about the theories, methods, and practices for planning mobility. And here one solution is to use the already existing interdisciplinary network on the European level, the ELTIS, the Urban Mobility Portal, who is quite fitting for that task, but also publishing new accessibility knowledge pool for research and planning methods, for example, with the German Research Foundation, to create handbooks on methods, on interdisciplinary instruments for these fields, so that we have different platforms where we bring together these scientists and researchers from engineering sciences and social sciences to use their knowledge to create better and more efficient solution and instruments that can be used for public mobility planning. And with that, I want to give to the three challenges, or add to the three challenges also three potentials for public mobility planning. We have a huge potential knowledge transfer, so there is a lot of knowledge in the scientific community. We just have to bring it to the practice. There's a transformation happening right now. For some it's not fast enough, but it's definitely happening. And there we can, as a scientist, as public mobility planner, guide this transformation process, support it in the administration, in the public transport corporation, to achieve a system that is capable of planning mobility. And the third part is the integration. That's especially important for the scientific community, where we integrate different knowledge pool, different perspectives on the topic, to get a better understanding of mobility. And the final aim, of course, is to change the mobility system to a more sustainable, social justice, but also environmental friendly mobility system without not including the needs of the people. So that's really important, in my opinion, to need something like public mobility planning to achieve that. And for that, there's a lot of work to do, but that's also good news. There is a lot of new project to find in this field, and I hope in the future we can all work together to create a public mobility system that is fit for the future. Thank you.